everyone. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion on using social media to understand mental health. I'm Alicia Violet. I'm a graduate research assistant at the Injury Prevention Research Center at Emory, or IPRES. IPRES supports research, education, and outreach for the purpose of reducing injury and the burden of injury in Georgia and the Southeast. Today, I'm joined by Arnel Condi, who is also a graduate research assistant at IPRES and will be helping me to facilitate this conversation. We are also joined today by Sachin Pense and Vedant Das Swain, who are both PhD candidates at Georgia Tech and will be telling us a little bit about the work that they do. If time permits, we will take audience questions at the end of the event. You can submit any questions that you have through the comments. So to begin with, can you give us a brief overview of the research that you are doing related to social media and mental health?
Yeah, I can go ahead and start first. So, hey everyone, yes, I'm Sachin. I'm a second-year PhD student here at Georgia Tech. And so my research is centered around how identity-based factors like our class, our gender identity, our sexual orientation, our racial identity, our cultural identity, how these things influence how we think about our mental health when we're in distress, and how we influence it, or how we express it when we're talking about it offline, right? When we talk about it on online context as well as on social media. So the thing is that historically, when we did research on mental health and in clinical psychology, we had people in the labs, but we didn't have a good sense of how people talk about their mental health in the real world. So part of my research is understanding how do people talk about their mental health in the real world, right, outside of the lab, and how do our identity, like these identity-based factors, influence how we talk about our mental health and where we go for care.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Right, I'll go ahead then. I'm Vedant. I'm a third-year PhD student at Georgia Tech, and very much like Sachin's work, which is also focused on real-world sort of implications and understanding of mental health, my work also looks at that from a different angle. So what I focus on is seeing the different everyday technologies people use. So that could be both online technologies like social media, as well as offline technologies like the phones, even just swipe cards, things like that. And what does that tell us about just everyday behavior, and how those everyday behaviors shed some light on social dynamics? And all of this is to come up with some sort of new scalable systems and applications to both support existing diagnoses or treatments, and mostly to come up with more complementary streams of data that can highlight certain things which are invisible from just patient visits and surveys and things like that.
Oh, that's really interesting. So how do you tailor this research to specific college campuses and low resource communities?
All right, so I'll go first on this one. For college campuses, I think, so a lot of my work has focused both on college campuses as well as also organizations like workspaces and office campuses. I think one thing that you first have to tailor is just the technology you're using. Is that like those resources change campus to campus, and sometimes that can also change based on just the population in that campus. So for something like Georgia Tech, a lot of people are connected to the Wi-Fi network at Georgia Tech. A lot of people might be using social media, but now with social media you pick differs by time, differs who your population is. Sometimes you could come up with sort of novel technologies, but if people aren't going to be using them, that's just harder to introduce and harder to expect a long-term study with it, right? So that's one end. And I think another thing we end up tailoring often is sort of the implications we're looking at. And those change because we ideally want people with domain expertise to come in. If we're talking about something for organizations, then we have to be very wary of, are our implications for all employees, or is it for specific employees who do desk work? If we're talking about campuses, are our implications for any campus, or is it for large universities, urban campuses with certain mental health resources already? So I think those are some of the things like end-to-end, which we end up thinking of, at least for campus situations.
Yeah, I think to build on that a little bit, thinking more about tailoring the kind of research we do to low resource communities, I think Vedant hit it on the nail there when he talked about how the implications we look at have to be tailored to the populations that we're thinking about. So in the case of my research, like I mentioned, a lot of it is looking at the differences between places that are well-resourced and have a lot of therapists, enough to meet the need, and places that simply don't have enough therapists. But the story is not just that there are not enough therapists in a given area. Like I mentioned before, the identities that we hold, our location has a huge influence on how we talk about our mental health. So like, for example, from my research, one of those location-based aspects that we separate out is, yes, a person might be in a place that doesn't have enough therapists, but do they live in a rural area versus an urban area? And we found that people who live in rural areas tend to use like religious aspects, physical language, much more to talk about their mental health than people in urban areas.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I definitely think those are a lot of important considerations for really tailoring your work to the specific community that you're working in. So for the work that you do using social media, are you utilizing multiple forms of social media, or do you focus on mostly one currently? And if it's only one, is there potential to expand to others as well?
So I think I think some of that is driven by the question you're trying to answer. So, for example, when in some of our work, when we wanted to look at just organizational culture, we wanted to look for something which kind of does not have the censorship issues, which a lot of certain social media could have a lot of censorship issues or disclosure issues. So we went for Glassdoor, right? So Glassdoor goes for it. Glassdoor by design has certain things that makes it a little unbiased. But if we're looking at, say, college campuses, then depending on the specific question, it could either be Facebook, or if you want to look at it aggregate, you don't care who the individual is, then you could say look at Reddit. But that applies for, say, Georgia Tech, because Georgia Tech has a good Reddit presence. So I think it depends a little based on the question. And the second thing is just based on how many people are using it. So like right now, I know a lot of Georgia Tech people aren't using, like undergrads don't use Facebook as much. Like it's kind of old to be using Facebook. Everybody's on Instagram. But then does Instagram really give researchers sort of that opportunity to look at that data, or like what is even feasible to do? Like image data is harder to process. There are more privacy issues, things like that. But then Instagram text data doesn't have enough information. So I think those are some of the trade-offs we have to decide based on availability, implications, and I just guess acquisition of the data.
Yeah, and to add a little bit onto that, I think that one of the ways that I also approach that in my research is that Vedant's absolutely right. Like the norms that a given community has around their technology use definitely have an influence on like which technologies we want to study, how we want to study them. So I augment a lot of my research with like qualitative interviews with people from the community to better get a sense of, okay, this is how you use language on social media, but why is it that you used XYZ wording versus like using this idea of thinking about mental health?
So can you tell us a little bit about how the machine learning technology you use works to gain insights about suicidal risk in your study populations?
Yes. So I think for machine learning methods and approaches, I think there are sometimes what happens is given the population and given sort of that underlying phenomena we're looking. So if it's suicidal ideation, we might come up with new approaches to use that learning model and all of that. But in many cases, it often starts out with a simple thing is first in our study, we need to collect some sort of ground truth. Now that ground truth could be self-reported. That ground truth could be from sort of a tangential source. It could be from, say, just clinical visits or something which is provided by a different stakeholder. And then comes in our data. And if our ground truth is something which is longitudinal, it's something that we want to look at it every day. So if we're looking at, say, their ideation risk week by week, then we need data that also changes week by week, right? So those things come in, and typically it's after all that data collection do we go in with our machine learning, which will always start with the most fundamental thing. Like I think one guiding principle I believe our lab at least goes by is if you can do it simply, just do it simply. And then if that's not working, if that's not giving you the signals, and sometimes um, another thing with machine learning that I should mention here is that it's not as simple as just pulling up the data and then throwing it and then you'll get something. You will get something, but something's going to be spurious if you just do it blindly like that. So we will work with, so with the Suicide Risk Project, we do have collaborators at Emory who will probably be informing, okay, we want to look at certain behaviors, like we want to look at isolation. We want to look at how many visits they had to certain locations like social locations, how many visits they had to like physical health locations. So they'll kind of help us craft which things we want to look at. And that gives us some more grounding. And then we'll come up with performance and those metrics. And I think eventually it comes down to whether that metric is even important. So is it as simple as saying somebody is high societal versus low societal, or should we come up with, say, a scale? Should we what is really actionable for the practitioner at the end, right? How much additional information do we need? Can all of it be done uh, without any human intervention at all, or any human contribution in the middle at all? So I think those things come up as you go through the project, but I think the main things is always get your ground truth, get your data, and then craft your data correctly. So I think that's sort of the process.
And like Vedant said, our collaborators at Emory are really, really helpful with regards to like figuring out which parts of that data we think might be predictive of someone's risk of suicidal ideation, or any kind of thoughts and behaviors. And in the case of my research, right, I think it fits very well into that framework that Vedant described, right? Part of it is understanding, right, where does location, right, where do identity-based factors, right? We know that they are influential, right, in terms of how people think about suicide and how people understand it when they're feeling suicidal. But what role does that play in like the greater prediction? Some of the machine learning work we do helps us better understand that.
Thank you so much, Sachin and Vedant. I'm actually going to interrupt the questions and ask a quick question of both of you. So for, your average person who may not know about machine learning, how would you give an elevator speech, or what would you say in the elevator speech to explain what is machine learning?
Oh, Sachin, you wanna try that first?
Yeah, yeah, I think that one of the things, I think that the best way to think about it is that, I mean, we do it in everyday life, right? We look at patterns that we see in the everyday world and we say, okay, well, there's a reasonable probability that, so I think like a similar thing, like one way of thinking about it is that when you go to like Kroger, right, you look at the parking lot and you see lots of cars and you say, well, there's a good likelihood that Kroger is very crowded and maybe I should go to Publix. Similarly, machines do the same thing, right? When machine learning, they take a look at the data, they take a look at what they have like what data they have access to, right? They look at the probability of a certain outcome happening, right? Someone like Kroger being crowded or Publix being crowded, and then they make a determination based on that, using statistics, using probability. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Sachin's example was really good. It's basically very, very similar to just any sort of learning process, but end of the day, it's all operationalized for the machine level. So it'll never be as nuanced as human learning. And of course, we don't know everything about human learning either, but essentially it's all probabilistic. So that's why, especially when we're doing things in this domain and in mental health, mental well-being, things like that, it's very important for us as ML researchers to make sure that whatever we're getting, it's a probability. There's decision noise in that. Just because two things are associated doesn't necessarily mean that this causes the other thing. What are sort of the disparities we are creating? Things like that. And I think for people who are very alien to what machine learning is, I would just say that just start with statistics. It's really just statistics. Just start with any sort of statistics class and work with any sort of simple data of trying to fit a regression or trying to fit a model. And when you start making that a little bit more complicated, that's when computer science people just come in and say machine learning, including
Yes.
people like me. But that's essentially what it is.
So in the context of our research, what that can look like is if a person like uses a lot of language centered around depression for 3 weeks, right? What is the likelihood that they might be suicidal or they may be experiencing suicidal ideation in the next like 3 weeks? That's the sort of way that we take that, like that kind of machine learning research.
Yeah, and I think
Wow,
just
that is
one
fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to add one more
Go
thing to
on,
that
Vedant.
is that the machine learning thing is, again, it's not like a silver bullet sort of thing. So like going back to
Mhm.
Sachin's example, so if we're looking at, say, language and we're looking at certain expressions, you as the developer of that pipeline, you as that researcher will have to come up with those expressions. You need to know what you're looking for. If
Mhm.
we're looking at, okay, how many responses did this person get which showed support, right? Those are the things you have to craft based on either some underlying taxonomy, which will again come from people like the professors at Emory. They will come up with sort of, this is the theory in psychology, that's what you got to take. So it's not just throw in data and it's going to magically come up with something. And if it does, you should be extremely suspicious about
Mhm.
what's going on, right? So be very careful about what you're looking for And that's kind of why we collaborate with people across the field, right? So we get a strong understanding over there.
I see. Okay, I'm really interested in this subject. So I have one more question. Alicia, Arnell, I hope you don't mind me kind of jumping in here. Um, how, I guess, I don't know if this question is the right question, but how long does it take for a machine to learn? I'm putting up air quotes, and for it to be more and more accurate, or either how long or how much data, like how do you know, like, okay, this machine learning mechanism is predicting or using stats in a way that's reliable?
I think that's a great question. So the there are certain standard practices which are used to validate your performance. So one of the ways we would do it is whatever data we have. So whatever, say we've got 10,000 observations, we'll go with, okay, we're going to keep some 8,000 of that to learn everything. We'll never look at the 2,000. We'll never look at the 2,000. We're just going to come up with the model, like a really good model with our 8,000. And then we'll test if the 2,000 is also performing as good, right? So that's the most basic kind of way. There are more sort of robust measures you can do. You could say that, okay, we're going to look at, we're going to build on like 8,000 or whatever. We tested on that 2,000. Now let's look at 2,000 from a different population entirely, right? So is there transferability between what I learned from, say, my Georgia Tech population? Can I throw that in and do it with the Emory population, right? And it might work, it might not work, right? Like two populations could be completely different. So that's another way. Then you could think about more sort of ways about, is it practical? Are you looking, if you're trying to forecast the future, then you should either learn, you should be learning from the past, right? So you'll slowly start tailoring it to make it that robustness. Like when you aim for practicality, that's how you get the robustness. And as far as like how much and how much time, I think um, the learning doesn't take long, right? What takes long is getting the data. That is always the slowest moving factor, like getting that real data. That takes long. For certain things like social media, you could just at one point you can get a snapshot of the past. You can get that, but for every sort of real time data, that'll take some time. But how long does it take for the model to be good? There really isn't a definite answer to that, because it's possible when you see new data, your model gets worse, right? And there are like real world examples of this where like things worked great at the start, and then they deployed it, and in a year they're like, oh wait a second, this doesn't really make any sense, right? Yeah, so there's no, I mean, I wish there was an answer to that. Like that'll make our PhD shorter, but but yeah, there I guess for machine learning, it's essentially you have to come up with your baselines. So sometimes for like in my work, the baseline would be with clinical self-reports, the machine learning was giving this outcome. With this new behavioral data, can we beat that outcome, right? Or for decision criteria, the doctors or clinicians expect this. Can we beat that baseline? So sometimes it's just based on what your baseline is.
I'll also add to that that it's also the case often that different machine learning models do better with different amounts of data. So sometimes it's dependent on the amount of data you have. So you've probably heard of like deep learning and neural networks in the news. Those models need like a lot of data to even be like minorly accurate. Whereas some of the regression techniques, right, some of the things that are more grounded in like traditional statistics still need a lot of data, but may not need nearly as much.
Fascinating. I love it. Okay, I'm going back on mute. Alicia, Arnell, take it away.
That's all really interesting. Thanks for giving those explanations. So what, if any, obstacles have you encountered while facilitating this project?
So I think in the case of my research, one of the obstacles that we run into sometimes is that, I mean, and this is more of a societal issue, right? Like there are a lot of people in rural and underserved areas who are not online, right? Like we are using social media to make conclusions about how people talk about their mental health in these areas, because it's much easier to do it than, and we get a much wider variety of people than we would if we did like one-on-one interviews. But the issue there, and one of the limitations, is that, well, the people that we're analyzing, right, the social media data that we're analyzing are people that happen to be very online, right? So that's one sort of limitation, kind of like barrier that we experience in our research. And like I mentioned, one of the ways that we sort of hedge against that is like limiting the like the scope of our conclusions, right? The implications, by ensuring that we talk about the fact that this is done on social media data, right? This is a limited subset of the population, but also, like I mentioned, doing qualitative interviews with people from these areas and asking them, well, these are the conclusions that our social media analysis came up with. Does this ring true to your lived experiences with your mental health, and how so, or how not so?
Yeah, I think another thing that kind of comes up, and I think this will be true even for like Sachin's work, is before we sort of even do these studies, I think there is a lot about just getting the underlying stakeholders connected in order to conduct a study in a reliable way. Because the whole promise of using something like social media is you can do this real world, right? You can do it unobtrusively. People just self-initiated, go and post stuff, right? You're not bringing them to a lab. But now when you need that additional ground truth from a self-report survey, how often are these people going to keep filling the surveys, right? So if they're not going to keep filling the surveys, then can we get some other information from, say, um, some other source, like whether if they go to the clinic, whether the clinician can fill out an exit survey, right? But for that to happen, we need those connections between the researchers. There could be collaborators, there could be facilities inside a campus. So like, for example, I think when it comes to something like COVID, like over the past year, I was working on COVID, and there Georgia Tech actually was rather cooperative. Like when I say Georgia Tech was cooperative, is like all the bodies inside Georgia Tech were quite cooperative to come up with ways for data use, for safe ways of sharing data, anonymized and things like that. So we could progress and come up with good, strong conclusions, which can affect policy and health policy and things like that. But for something like, say, mental health, when it comes to research, certain campuses are still nascent. They might, like, I mean, even for having counseling centers, they're nascent. But then having counseling center which is okay with doing research on that, that's another stage. So those underlying connections become very important. And what researchers then end up doing is that if we can't do that, we have to come up with another way. But that other way, you're definitely compromising something, right? So you will change your studies length, you'll change the kind of questions you're pursuing based on that. Like you'll start tweaking things a bit around.
And I think, just to interject real quick, I think that one of the things that's been great about working in this lab, and as well as the work that we do with our collaborators with Emory, at Emory, I think that one of the things that we root, right, when we're thinking about, okay, how do we do this research project? What kinds of questions are we addressing? I think that we try to make sure that we are really, really rooting the questions that we're asking in impact, right, and the lived experiences of the people that we're working with. Because I mean, it can be a scary thing, right, to share some of your most intimate personal experiences with mental health on social media, and we want to do justice to people's lived experiences there.
Love it. This is just so fascinating, and I think this topic is very relevant, especially in the times that we're in currently. I want to ask, how can your findings and this new knowledge be utilized to identify and address suicide risk in various populations in the future?
Yeah, so I can start with that. So I think one of the core parts of why I do this research and why we do this research is that, I mean, language is the key, right, for us to be able, when we go to a clinic, right, when we go to a psychiatrist, when we go to a therapist, one of the main ways that we communicate how we're feeling is the language that we use. And whether the person on the other side understands why we're feeling distressed or where that distress is coming from, that's like the key for us to be able to get treatment. And I think that what often ends up happening, and research shows this as well, is that if someone does not understand, right, that when someone is talking about religion in the clinic, or if someone is talking about bodily symptoms in the clinic, like those things can also be indicative of mental health concerns, particularly in like I mentioned, rural and underserved areas. If people don't understand that, then people don't get the care that they need. So I think one of the like places that this research has a lot of potential is better understanding how people in these areas talk about their mental health, and giving clinicians places to look for, right, in terms of specific things to pay attention to in given communities when they're in the clinic and they hear people coming in and saying things about how they're feeling.
And I think another thing, just in general, also just like expand on what Sachin was saying, is traditionally for a lot of mental health work and sort of counseling and things like that, like traditional methods like diary studies, those have always existed, right? So maintain a diary. Now, I guess the fundamental spot where we enter is that we think that there is a blind spot, and this sort of agreeably so is either the people won't record everything, or what they record is not going to be as because they know it's going to be read by somebody else that might be filtered in a particular way. So there are sort of those blind spots that come in. Now, our hope is always to come up with something that can complement what already exists, right? So it's essentially to empower sort of the clinicians as well as also the um, people themselves who are seeking this care, that okay, well, this is all the things I did. I don't, I don't need to necessarily like go in and need the overhead of now putting in this extra thing. I was actually sitting in this place and I like posted this particular thing, and that's just what it means, right? And that could be additional evidence that could sort of be impetus for more discussions, and it's sort of giving that extra auxiliary stream to come up with a more well-rounded understanding outside of just that 1 hour or whatever they consult, right? So I think that's kind of where we come in, and like our hope is that we can come up with, like very solid detection systems and things like that. But I think like that's the aim. But where we're already at, I think somewhere is bringing those clinicians. Okay, this is what these people were doing, and this is how they respond on social media. Could that be indicative of something which you're seeing in, say, your surveys? Might be, might not be, right? So that's kind of how we go about it.
Yeah, I think that sounds really interesting and really exciting as well. So at this time, we'd like to open the conversation up to any questions that the audience has about anything that we've talked about today or the work that you both do. Ashley, do we have any questions at this time?
Yes, we have really one great question here. So this person says, I have a technical question. For the data type, I was wondering if posted videos, photos on a user's social media, as well as text data could help build a better detection model or even interrupt the model building.
So when they're saying interrupt the model building, I'm guessing they mean make it worse or like be like detrimental, I guess is what they're saying. I think to speak to that, just in general, I would say that like a lot of the data we use is just text-based, right? We will look for certain psycholinguistic cues. We look for certain just open vocabulary. What are the kind of words they're using? Sometimes we look at very top down. We look at the kind of words they're using. But when it comes to videos and multimedia, typically we tend not to use that kind of data. I mean, there are certain practical limitations to it also, just like it's an overhead on storage, it's an overhead on processing, and there's obviously the societal limitation of, are you okay with showing photos, right? Are you okay with showing videos? And also consent, like a video of yourself is fine, what about the video of a friend, right? So those things get a little more complicated, but sometimes even just if we know that a post had a photo in it, had a video in it, even those simple tags can be helpful. And the with machine learning, let's sort of going back to some of the previous questions that Ashley was asking, it is essentially our work is to figure out what matters and what doesn't matter. So if it turns out that those three things like text, photo, and video are interrupting the model, so to say, then we get rid of that, right? We look at just simpler things. We look at, were they logged in? Did they even visit the thing? And that's how sort of how you go about it.
Okay. There aren't any other questions in the chat box, but because I'm so curious about this subject, I have another question for you. So what are, okay, say you do your machine learning, you get your outcomes and your results. What's next? Like, what are some of the interventions that can be put in place based off of the results that you have? Or maybe even how does this impact policies? I guess I'm trying to think about the connection to the community and how this type of research makes an impact long term. And so, yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, so I think in the case of the research we do in under-resourced with under-resourced communities, like I mentioned before, one of the things that we can do is, okay, we can get a better sense of even when people, so if we know that when like people in rural and under like shortage areas are primarily using religious language to talk about their mental health, then maybe churches, right? Or maybe temples or mosques or synagogues, maybe those are like great places in rural areas to have like you said, like a policy intervention, like more resources about therapists in the area. Or maybe like I mentioned, like we tell clinicians in these areas, hey, if people mention God a lot when they are in a session, maybe you should administer like a structured clinical interview, right? Or a PHQ or some kind of diagnostic interview. Yeah, that's one implication of my research, I think.
Yeah, and I think others, I think for implications, interventions, I guess, are like a practical kind of implication. And many times going straight up to an intervention is could be a little premature. So sometimes our machine learning outcomes are just diagnostic lenses, right? So it's just sort of a lens. So if I can use social media data to understand, say, just expressions of culture, right? About, for example, whether a campus is that a campus which has just a culture of low sleep, right? And that's something I can figure out just how people talk about it, when people post and things like that. Then that's just giving us really a lens, and that might then drive future policy. But sometimes machine learning can also be used to demonstrate a policy, right? So with some of the COVID work, we were actually able to demonstrate that, okay, if you take this data and based on this data, you decide to close things on XYZ days, this is how outcomes are going to look like, right? So it could be based on that. There are definitely more sophisticated ways to approach an intervention with machine learning. But again, for like anything health related, to really get into that, you have to do a proper trial, really come up with something that's going to be really solid, like just like any medication, right? So that's definitely a step ahead.
Yeah. That's really interesting. Thank you for that. All right. So thank you to everyone who has joined this conversation today. This has been a really great conversation. I want to say a special thank you to my co-facilitator, Arnell, as well as to Sachin and Vedant for joining us today. While you're here on our Facebook page, make sure that you like the iPrice Facebook page so you can stay up to date with any of our upcoming events. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.